time. Hi, everyone. My name is Megan Atha. I am the instructor for EDF 4470 Classroom Assessment, as well as EDF 4424 Youth Focused Evaluation. The presentation I'm about to give you is intended to help you understand different domains of learning or development that your students out in the field will be mastering under your guidance, either as a teacher or a program director. I speak broadly about this because learning standards have been around for a really long time, and they're important for helping us develop a scope and sequence of learning happening at different grade levels within school districts or in different classrooms within out-of-school contexts, such as the Boys and Girls Clubs or the YMCA or after-school programs of those types. So let's just get started. I'm going to scroll down. I want you all to understand that when we are doing any kind of assessment practice in our work with youth, in the state of Florida, if you're in a public school, that work is going to be very much driven by Florida standards. Those standards are published at the CPALM's website, which I shared with you in the modules. But there's a list for all the different learning standards that have been developed for every imaginable content area. And yes, you're going to find that there's a focus on certain standards above other standards. And it's a fascinating study was recently done by one of the College of Education undergraduates in collaboration with a faculty member, where they discovered that many of these standards, which have been broken down into learning objectives, are measuring very low levels of cognition, right? And we can all speculate about why that may be the case, but it's certainly something to note, right? So in a backwards design model, this is especially important for those of you who are education minors or child and youth studies majors. What typically happens in an educational setting is you start with the standard that you want your students to master. And then you take that standard and you break it down into smaller learning objectives, also known as learning targets. This is explained in your textbook if you're using the Macmillan textbook. Then, once you've determined what the standard is and the learning objectives that go with that standard, then and only then do you start thinking about what assessments would align to those objectives and standards. Excuse me. Once your objectives are decided and your assessments are aligned, that's when you start planning the lessons and activities for the unit. A lot of times teachers do this in a very different sequence. And a lot of teachers get really excited about some really cool activity that they saw that they want to do in their classroom, but they're not thinking about purposeful and intentional ways to use that activity in service to mastering the content. Okay, so let's break it down. A standard is typically something that's predetermined by, in our case, the Florida Department of Education. It's really outlining what students should be able to do and what they should know at the end of an instructional unit. Whereas a learning objective, also known as a learning target, is something that you get to determine. You are explaining how your students will get to that knowledge and those skills that the standards have outlined. You are contextualizing those learning objectives to your lessons. You get to explain how the students will demonstrate the mastery of that knowledge and skills in the way that you write the learning objective. So let's look at it. Here's the components that go into writing a learning objective or a target. First, you're always thinking about the audience, who it is that you want to achieve these objectives. In our case, if you're in EDF 4470, we are talking about students. We want our K-12 students to master these objectives. If you are in EDF 4424, you may be thinking of students, or you may be thinking of youth that are doing an after-school program who are not intended to be graded on anything, but you might be measuring how much they make developmental growth. Or you might be an administrator and you're starting to measure how well your teachers are learning or how well your staff is learning. This can be applied in almost any learning context. Next, you're going to think about the verbs in a statement that you're writing. You want to use action verbs that demonstrate or describe something measurable, some kind of measurable behavior that you want the students to do and master. You're going to add a condition to the statement so that the behavior you're expecting from your audience can be achieved in a context. In this case, you see an example of like, well, they can master the skill if given a calculator or if having help reading. You know, you want to make the condition very clear. And finally, the degree. You need to specify the criterion where possible for an acceptable performance. So let's give an example. If the objective is about learners, students, youth will be able to apply the standard deviation rule to the special case of distributions having a normal shape. Well, you can see in this example, I have the audience picked out, that's learners. I have the behavior, I want them to apply this rule, and I have the condition. This is where I want them to apply the rule. Well, what's it missing? There's something missing from the statement, and that is going to be the behavior, how I want them to get there, and the conditions where I set the standard, the degree. So given a diagram of the eye, learners will be able to label the 9 extraocular muscles and describe, so 2 things, labeling and describing, at least 2 of their actions. At this point, that would tell me that if my students can do this with at least 2 of these muscles, that is enough of mastery for my liking. Okay, so that's a very well created learning objective or target. Let's look at how they might be, how these types of objectives could be measured, right? So what I've done here is I've color coded. I took the standard and I have broken them up into 4 different objectives. So this is a language arts standard for 1st grade. And we are asking that these kids are able to ask and answer questions about key details in a text, read aloud, or information presented orally or through media. So if I really break this down, there's a lot going on. I'm asking questions about key details in a text read aloud. So kids need to be able to ask questions about that, about details in the text. Then we're asking them to ask questions about details in information that's presented orally, right? So it's not just me reading a story to kids and they ask me questions, but I might give them information orally without the text that they have to be able to ask me questions. I also want them to be able to ask questions about key details in other media, because what I want you to do is look at this and button. See the and conjunction. Oops, I went too fast. When you see ask and answer, you're really looking at 2 skills happening, asking and answering. So then if I combine that with the other details of the content standard, I end up with lots of very specific skills that I want these students to be able to achieve. And then you can see here, I don't know why I've got some of these capitalized and some I don't, but whatever. In the end, I want them to be able to answer questions about key details in the text. I want them to answer questions about key details in information. I want them to answer questions about key details in other media. So you can see that I didn't list out number 5 and 6 because I think you get the picture. But when you deconstruct a standard, you look at the verbs and you look at the predicates of a sentence. And within those predicates, you're going to see content that's related to the concepts and knowledge you want students to master. Here's another example for math. I just wanted to give you another option. And I want to show you an example within the College of Education here at FGCU. So we often will typically set mastery of a learning objective at 80%. So down below, you see 3 examples. By correctly answering 4 out of 5 multiple choice questions, students will demonstrate mastery of the ability to analyze the shape of a distribution with 80% accuracy, right? That's one way to state it. It's kind of wordy, but it gets you all the pieces that you need. Students will create a visual organizer of a data set to include constructing a graph and accompanying table with 80% accuracy as measured by a rubric, right? So you get the picture. It's got targets, it's got conditions, it's got the audience, it's got all the components of a really good, well-written learning objective. So what's going on? How does this relate to assessment? Well, when you have a really, really well-written learning objective that comes from a standard, I think it's pretty easy to decide what kind of assessments are needed. And let me just go back here. For example, in the first I'm so fast. In this first learning objective, by correctly answering 4 out of 5 multiple choice questions, well, I've already told you what kind of assessment is going to be taking place. You're using a traditional test. Well, the second option, a visual organizer, is a different type of assessment that makes more sense if your verb is about constructing a graph. So you want there to be alignment. If the standard says construct a graph, you're not going to give people a standardized test with multiple choice. You're going to have them actually create a graph. So here's the assessment sequence. Once you have your standards selected and your learning objectives written, and you're deciding on an assessment plan for how to measure the degree to which your students have mastered that content, usually what you would do is you give yourself a week or so for a unit, or maybe 2 if it's a big unit, and you design a pre-assessment that aligns to those standards and objectives. And then you do some teaching and instructional activities, and then you might give out some formative assessments for your students. That's to help you understand how well they're mastering the content without assigning them a grade, right? Because a formative assessment is really about forming your opinion and idea based on their progress on how well they're mastering content. And as you're doing that, you're providing feedback to the students saying, hey, good job, you really worked hard on that, and I see you've mastered this idea. Or you might say something like, hey, you're not there yet, here's where I see that you might be having some difficulty. And you're really targeted and specific about that feedback you're giving. And then once you've provided some feedback, you go back and do some more instructional activities, and you do some more formative assessments, and you do some more feedback, right? And then once you've done all of that, you can finally feel like, hey, my students really have a good sense and grasp of this content. I believe if I were to give them a summative assessment, they should be mastering the standard as measured through learning objectives. So I now can give them a summative assessment, which could be in any kind of format. It could be a traditional test. It could be a project that needs a rubric. Whatever the format is, it's as long as it's aligned to the learning objectives, you have a good tool for measuring learning. Okay, and I have a slide in here where it kind of goes down and breaks down these concepts to you again. And you can refer to that as you're working on your homework this week. I really hope that this presentation was helpful. We're right at 15 minutes. Bye. Okay, I would like to go in here. Oh, I'm still going. Okay, whoops.